My name is Ed Cruikshank, and I'm a financial advisor and team lead here at our Lincolnshire office. I also live in nearby Mundelein, Illinois, and have been an advisor here for nearly 20 years. Joining me today is our Regional Director of Advisory, Dominic Enzavino. Thanks for being with us here today, Dom.
Thanks so much, Ed. I appreciate the time and the opportunity to speak along with you today. I'm a regional director here at Savant, and that means I have an opportunity to sit with our advisor team who directly help our clients. Prior to my current role, I was an advisor for about 10 years, doing for the most part exactly what Ed does, an opportunity to help clients achieve their financial goals. So Ed, thanks for the opportunity to be here.
Absolutely. So here's an overlook of the agenda we're going to cover today. Common financial challenges faced by families, strategies for talking about money, managing inheritances, building a strong financial foundation, and then if time allows, we'll take some Q&A at the end. So first section, common financial challenges faced by families. We have about 7 listed here. Dom, why don't you kick us off?
That sounds great, Ed. You know, when we think about the first item, the first challenge that's listed there, too much debt, and we think about the family in general, the reality of stress and the reality of what's weighing down the family in general without the idea of too much debt can be overcoming or can be overwhelming. But when we overlay the idea of too much debt over and above the idea of what the family does each and every day to find success, it makes problems more problematic. It makes stressful situations more stressful. What we've realized is the average household debt across America is about $102,000. Now, that is mortgage debt, that's mortgage payments, mortgage debt, that's credit card debt, auto loans, loans in general, beyond that. And the truth of the matter is, along with that debt comes a level of stress. What we see is when you have that level of stress that exists, there's a direct correlation between stress and the reality of having medical issues. So the second item that we're going to talk about is staggering healthcare costs. The impact that debt and stress have on the idea of healthcare, it feeds into that second point, staggering healthcare costs. I don't think anyone would be surprised by the idea of knowing that healthcare costs are increasing. In fact, year over year, each year, we're seeing about a 5% growth rate, inflation rate, as it relates to healthcare costs. When someone sits with an advisor here at Savant, what we do is we put a financial plan in place. Included in that financial plan is the cost of healthcare and retirement. And that's a significant amount. On average, a couple 65 years old in retirement needs to have about $315,000 saved in retirement to cover the cost of healthcare. That's a significant amount. What we realize then is, what we realize is there's 2 things that happen that individuals do. First, they'll take the initiative to save and prepare for some of that healthcare cost, which means they'll open up health savings accounts or accounts that they'll intend to use for that healthcare cost in retirement. That's the first option. And quite honestly, that's the better option. The second option is to close their eyes and literally say to themselves, I hope things will be okay. These are challenges that families face and decisions that families face where they're kicking the problem down the line. The truth of the matter is strategies of hope, they really don't work. But when someone says, I hope the cost of healthcare doesn't jump up on me, or I hope I won't have to worry about costs of healthcare not allowing me to accomplish my dreams in retirement, those don't typically end well. I mentioned earlier that prior to my current role, I served as an advisor as well. And one of the stories that jumps out at me and really puts an exclamation point on the idea of staggering healthcare costs is a couple that came to visit me in my office, who I hadn't met before, but they scheduled time with me because there was a concern about the cost of healthcare for them in retirement. So typically I'll meet anyone who's meeting with me at the door. And I did that in this case. When I met with them at the door, I realized there was something very heavy on their mind. wasn't a whole lot of welcoming that went on at that moment. But before we actually had some of that welcome dialogue, I invited them back to the conference room. We sat down and I immediately asked the question, what's on your mind? And the gentleman looked at his wife and looked back at me. And he said, Dominic, you're absolutely right. There's something on my mind. He said, the cost of healthcare is destroying our retirement. And then he looked at his wife and he said, you know what? I have a solution though. And he said, I'm going to go back to work. And when I go back to work, I'll get on that employer plan. And when I get on that employer plan, I'll be covered. And he looked at his wife and said, and you'll be covered too. And we'll be good. And then there was an awkward silence. And I thought to myself, there's no way in the world that he wants to go back to work. And I knew even more so that she did not want him to go back to work. So I said, okay, I understand. And there's a reason you're here, because you're not sure. And I said, it might make perfect sense for you to go back to work, but it might not. The cost of healthcare, indeed, it's going up. But what we also need to know is the cost of that employer plan. It too is going up. We spent the rest of our time that day talking about their situation. And then we decided, you know what, it made perfect sense for us to meet again. And we put a financial plan in place. And during that time, they realized that if they made some sacrifices and budgeted and pulled back on some spending habits, they did not have to make the decision to go back to work. They just became a little bit more disciplined in their time in retirement. Now, that's a good news story. Truth of the matter is that isn't always the case. The reason I bring this story up is for two reasons. One, strategies of hope don't typically work at all. They just don't. The other reason I bring it up is because it's never too late to plan. I use the idea or the example of leading up to retirement, opening up HSA accounts, savings accounts that will be used specifically for that expected $300,000 plus that will be used in retirement, specifically for healthcare. If you plan up to retirement, sure, that'll make things a little bit easier and you might not find yourself in a circumstance much like this couple is in. But if you wait, much like this couple, there's still an opportunity to plan. So it's important to remember. I'm going to move on to conflicting family or financial values. Our advisors sit with a number of clients and many people, and we talk about their current situation. Here's what we see, and here's what we know. Families who have open dialogue as it relates to financial topics, these are the families and individuals that are on the same page. These conversations don't just typically happen, but we'll also see an attraction between different behaviors in terms of spending. We might have a spender, we might have a saver. Unless we're talking, unless we become aligned on what our values are and having those very, very important conversations, it can create conflict. It can create stress. It can create distrust. So in order to come together in terms of our family values, we can have those conversations about how much are we spending? How much should we spend? Let's create a budget and stay current with regard to that budget. The other interesting thing with regard to conflicting family values is we don't see arguments, or we don't hear of arguments for the most part on the topic of how much money is coming in. We're seeing distrust more so on the side of how those assets are being spent, the allocation of those assets, what accounts are established, what are we spending that money on. That's where some of the uncomfortable conversations end up being from or being directed toward. So it's important to be honest, transparent, and current in that dialogue to bring those disparate financial values to the center for a balance. And lastly, saving for retirement. Again, what we know is if we address the debt issue, if we make sure that we're not in a situation where we have strategies of hope as it relates to one of the largest expenses in retirement, and that's healthcare. And if we make sure that we're speaking about some of those very, very important financial topics as families, we know we give ourselves the opportunity to do things like save for retirement. Your future self will thank you, and it'll give you the opportunity to, again, accomplish those goals later on in life. Ed, I'm going to turn it back over to you for the last three common challenges.
Great, thanks, Dom. Saving for college, much like healthcare costs, college costs have consistently been outpacing general inflation almost by more than 2 times. So similar to healthcare, saving for college is something that can cause a lot of stress in families. There needs to be a plan put in place well before the child gets closer to college. Savings plans, understanding what you can and can't afford, being transparent with your children and letting them know what the constraints are and what type of costs the family is able to afford. This will, again, going back to common communication, transparent communication, being transparent with your children about what the family is able to afford really helps reduce stress and helps reduce surprises. Helping parents or siblings. I see this quite often with some clients I work with where sometimes they have to financially help their parents, sometimes they're maybe helping siblings, all while they're trying to save for their retirement and trying to save for college for their kids. This is commonly known as sort of the sandwich generation. And it also can create a great deal of stress in family situations. Lastly, needs versus wants versus wishes. How do you determine? How do you find what the best way is to work through these issues towards retirement? It really goes back to what Dom mentioned earlier, having a very open and frequent communication with your family, sitting down, putting a budget together, understanding really what do you need to keep the lights on and maintain just a certain standard of living, and is there room for discretionary spending and maybe a wishful spending on occasion down the road. It all comes back to the basic blocking and tackling of budget and spending and communication and getting a real handle on that. So next, we're going to go to the next section, which is strategies for talking about money. So we've seen some common challenges that everyone faces. And Dom's going to now go over, strategies with how to have these type of conversations with family to handle the stress and tensions.
Thank you, Ed. Just a question in general to everyone. When was the last time that you had a real conversation about money with a family member? And maybe it's recent, and that's individual, but it doesn't just happen. It's one of those things that we have to be intentional about in terms of having that kind of conversation. We talk about making the family and money conversation a meeting. The reason we recommend that is because we need to be intentional about setting time aside to talk about this. And it's not as much about the idea of setting time up to talk about money. It's really what we're avoiding. And what we're avoiding is that all of a sudden conversation or unexpected chat about a topic that generates some friction, because we just avoid having the conversation. So in order to make sure that we're having this conversation, we recommend that you set time up, whether it be monthly, whether it be quarterly. We recommend that you put time on the calendar to have that conversation. Now, when you have that conversation, it's really recommended to not speak in broad strokes. You want to be able to maintain the topic of discussion, keep emotions in check, because certainly if this is the first time that you're talking about money as a family, everyone's going to have an opinion and there will be emotions that are involved. So we want you to narrow the conversation. The more simple the conversation is, the easier the conversation will be. So when we're talking about things that are very difficult to speak about when it comes to a family, and we see that in terms of an aging parent potentially, as an example, and the conversation about long-term care. Rather than talk about the possibilities of where this can go or what could occur, think about the options just in terms of, okay, what will the cost be and how do we address that? Is there coverage for long-term care for this particular situation? You really break things down to have small wins in terms of that conversation. Another example that we see being important yet potentially emotional is conversations about college planning. So rather than broad strokes, landing on the idea of, oh no, this is going to be a whole lot of money and we're not sure where this is going to come from, we look at this in terms of, okay, what are our options? What does the college cost? What are our options in terms of finances? How are we going to pay this? How could we go get help? So narrow the conversation, make it as simple as possible. Meet as often as you need to. The conversation that you have when you set that time aside and put it on the calendar, it's not meant to be the only meeting. It's meant to be the first meeting. So as you move forward, once you have a meeting, the idea is to talk about the most important things and set the stage for what's next to be discussed in future meetings as a family. It sounds formal, but it checks the box to make sure that you're intentional and deliberate in having those conversations. And then finding neutral help if needed. This could be in a couple different areas. If we're talking about a budget, it could be finding a family member or a friend who understands how budgets work, and they're very good at managing money. Or it could be on the other end of the spectrum where you're looking for neutral help because you're beginning to have a conversation about legacy with the family, distribution of those assets. And if the idea is to say, okay, one of our children or one of our grandchildren are going to spend XYZ when they get their inheritance, it's important to bring in a professional. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we discuss estate planning attorneys and financial planners. Regardless, though, as we think through those 4 points that we just laid out, making sure that we put it on the calendar, narrowing the scope of the meeting, having an ongoing time of discussion, there's no one that this applies more to than our youth. If we're setting the stage for our kids, our children, and our grandchildren, you know that you've got an opportunity to impact the future. One of the most powerful things that I heard from a client who grew up worked very, very hard, that was in a position to bless his family, he told me, he said, Dominic, I am going to change the cycle. And by doing that, he talked about some of the things that you see on the screen right now in terms of changing the cycle. When we establish a system of chores, that's an opportunity to generate income. That's their first job for the most part. And we could talk about how that could be spent along the way. And that's point 2. We'll talk about the spend, save, invest, donate, or tithe options once our children and grandchildren start to generate some of that income. Real life experiences, I guess 2 things come to mind here. One, in that very same example of that client, he would actually have his children involved, not so much with the amount of his accounts, but how he would actually manage and see some of his accounts. He would actually give them an opportunity to see how he makes decisions, what types of accounts he has as a dad. And it taught them a lot in terms of changing the cycle once again and making it second nature for them to know and understand how to actually handle money and finances. The power of compounding is an incredible tool to really build wealth. And there's nothing more impressive than when you have that conversation with a child or with a grandchild when they're ready for them to know and understand what that would mean down the road. And then lastly, setting the stage for what happens when they get their first job. Make sure that if a 401k or a 401(k) opportunity is there, let's take advantage of that. Let's gather that free money. If there's an opportunity to open an IRA, a Roth IRA, or an account that you can actually create for college planning, let's do that. Let's talk about the why. The last thing that I'll mention with regard to having the money conversation is, again, circling back to the budget. Being disciplined as an individual becomes exponential when you're disciplined as a family. Good habits that budgets create for an individual create good habits for a budget or on a budget or for the family. These areas that you're looking at here are just some fun things to be thinking about as you prepare to talk about financial topics and align financial values across the family. The first is vacations. It's one thing to have an idea of where folks want to go, where the family would like to go. It's another level of conversation to decide, okay, here's what's within the budget. And it's a great explanation as to why maybe a trip to Hawaii might not be a reality, but instead of that, renting an RV and traveling down the East Coast might be a better option from a budget standpoint. They'll understand the why behind that. Showing how to focus on needs and wants. Ed mentioned needs and wants earlier. As an advisor, these are things that come up quite often. We talk about, okay, we need transportation. We want a brand new vehicle. From a financial planning standpoint, we build in whether it makes sense to have a brand new vehicle. As far as talking to the family goes, does it make sense to have a brand new vehicle? Or from a budget standpoint, does it make sense to get a car? So again, we could have the why behind that conversation happen for the family. Finding or having a college fund goal chart, we've seen this done a number of different ways. Some will have a temperature gauge, and as you move to save money year over year, month over month, year over year, and get closer and closer to those college years, you can see how close you are, a great visual to show progress. And when you meet that goal, celebrate. That's one thing that we just don't do as people. We don't celebrate goals enough. And then lastly, the emergency fund and why it's important. This could be different for every individual family. It could be 3 months of bills. It could be 6 months of bills. But the bottom line is it's dependent on you. The other thing is, again, going back to that celebration piece, set a goal. Once you hit that goal, celebrate. Give yourself an opportunity to high five as a family. And the other thing that I've seen very, very helpful as a family is to go beyond the individual emergency fund. Everybody can have an emergency fund. As long as we know this fund is for those rainy day items, those unexpected expenses. Ed, I'm going to turn it back over to you to go over managing inheritances.
Great, Tom, thanks. Those are some great tools for open communication and creative ideas to really help reduce tension among families with regard to financial matters. I'm going to touch on another area briefly, which can also add to tension and stress among families, which has to do with inheritances and how that can change the dynamic among family members and possibly create tension. Before we do that, though, let's just show a little bit of what the state and estate tax is within different states around the country. As you can see, this is as of the end of 2021. The majority of states do not have a state tax, but there are some that do, including Illinois. The Illinois estate tax is currently $4 million. What this means is if you die and your estate is worth less than $4 million, the state will not owe anything, to the state of Illinois. If your state is worth more than $4 million, there is a progressive estate tax rate, and your state will have to pay money before it can be dispersed to your heirs. Unlike some other states, the Illinois exemption is not portable between spouses. So when both people and married couple, for instance, have died, the exemption is still just $4 million. When considering a future inheritance situation, you need to do some planning and take this into account with a sound estate plan. It's really, really important. Some areas that can help alleviate tension and stress within families is, the trustee selection and deciding who's going to be trustees for your estate and how that's going to be handled. It can be individuals, family members, but you also have to take into account how is the family dynamic. Is family in harmony in good shape, or are there issues there? And maybe you don't want to burden a family member with being a trustee of the estate. You can also look at trustee selection and estate planning. Managing the tensions has to do with newly married heirs or troubled marriages. There can add some concerns and some tension in the families when there's that type of situation. So having an appropriate estate plan and appropriate trustee selected, taking those things into account can be very important, very helpful. You can decide to have independent or corporate trustees, which are really disinterested third parties, not type of family members. So they sort of are not involved in the family drama, so to speak, but they're there just to execute and follow the trust to the letter of the law. So having a third party like that can make sense as well and can reduce stress and tension in the families. And lastly, you could look at layered trustees where you could have family as co-trustees as primary, but if needed, you can have a corporate trustee as secondary to help step in if needed. There's also something that's becoming more popular as of late, which is a trust protector. And a trust protector is usually a third party, usually an attorney, that's given the power within the trust and by law to allow the make sure the trustee does the right thing, so to speak. Think about the trust protector as almost like a traffic cop for a trust situation. They can modify the terms to comply with grantor's intent. It can give them greater flexibility when dealing with changes in circumstances. You may be concerned that the trustee that you've appointed may not pay sufficient attention and may not be on the ball, so to speak. Trust protector can address those issues as well. And you may just wish that a third party, such as a trust protector, can act as a main point of contact between both the beneficiaries and the trustee. So trust protector is something that can really help alleviate, again, stress and tension in families with regard to inheritance. Some other general considerations, just when it comes to inheritance, whenever we're creating financial plans for our clients, we really never try to assume anything, and we coach them not to assume anything or expect anything as well. Don't assume you'll get an inheritance. Build a plan on your own assets. Don't have to count on what you may or may not get. So you really shouldn't count on it. We believe it's too risky to do that for your own plan. Timing. Make sure you take your time. Never feel like you're in a rush or a sense of urgency as you're going through the estate process and settlement process. There's different decisions you have to make, some very, very important. So make sure you take your time. Always, we feel it's important to get both planning and tax advice early on as the estate is being settled, making sure you're making the right decisions for the right reasons for the long term. And lastly, communication. As Dom touched on earlier, a lot of great communication tips. Communicating early and often, be as transparent as you possibly can. All of these things can really help nip in the bud, if you will, potential tensions and stresses that families have when you have inheritances coming through. Touching briefly on leaving IRA assets to your heirs. Again, there's some pros and cons to both of these approaches. You can just leave them to your outright beneficiaries within the IRA, and that has low complexity, but also doesn't have asset protection should creditors or other people come for that. It's also potentially more tax income efficient. But if you leave an IRA in a trust, you have to understand too, it adds in a higher degree of complexity, however, greater asset protection, more than likely, but it's also potentially less tax income efficient. So things to consider as you're making your beneficiary designations with regard to inheritance for your heirs. All right, I'm going to turn over back to Dom to sort of bring us home with building a strong financial foundation, and then we'll possibly take some Q&A at the end.
Thanks so much, Ed. I think you'd agree that anything without a strong base or a strong foundation, it likely doesn't last, right? So let's talk about some tips to make sure that we have a strong foundation in terms of our finances as a family. Have and follow a budget. Create a budget and follow it. Basically saying, make sure we don't spend more than we make, and then ultimately making sure that we don't run out of money. So having a budget isn't the easiest thing, but nothing easy is really worth it. But having a budget allows you to do things like eventually save for retirement, because you'll have that extra spending dollar to be able to save for retirement. Establish an emergency fund. We talked a little bit about this earlier. It's completely dependent on your personal situation. It could be that 3 months bills, could be 6 months. It's completely dependent on your situation, but have a goal. And once you meet that goal, what did we say? We said, make sure you celebrate, because it's a worthy goal. It's a worthy achievement. Creating goals and investing wisely, it falls right along into the previous point that we're making about having an emergency fund, setting that goal and celebrating. Creating goals and investing wisely, you could expand the conversation to what a day in a life for Ed and our advisors here at Savant looks like. When we talk about goals, we talk about dreams. What are your goals in retirement? In many cases, those are dreams. I was having a conversation with one of our advisors out of Plymouth who regularly has goal-based conversations like Ed with their clients. And the idea of understanding what someone's goal is in retirement, that's essentially what the dream is for them in retirement, and provides a target. Once you identify what that target is, it's now time to put a plan in place to go hit that target. One of the biggest expenses in retirement is the cost of healthcare. I talked about an average 65-year-old couple needing over $300,000 saved for healthcare alone. That's a big number, and it's a number to really scare some stiff. Strategies of help or of hope, they just don't work. So it's important to think through how we can address some of these things to avoid that catastrophic expense later on in life. And lastly, making sure that you update your final documents. One of the questions that we hear quite often is, do I need a will or do I need a trust? Speaking with the right professionals allows you to understand very clearly whether or not one of those makes better sense than the other. The other example that we talked about earlier, controlling distribution of your assets. Again, having an estate plan in place allows you to make sure your wishes are being followed through from a legacy standpoint. So where do we go from here? The professionals are some of those same people that you can establish relationships with. If you don't already have these relationships, to check the necessary boxes and cross the appropriate T's and dot the I's. As a fiduciary, it's important that the financial professional that you're working with or speaking with, that they're a fiduciary. And that's not always a given. It really isn't. I'll bring that up here again here in a moment. From a financial advisor standpoint, it's important to, as you think through your goals and invest wisely, you're working with someone who can help you from an advisory standpoint. And it's important that that advisor is a fiduciary working on your behalf. Some additional professionals that are important for you to be working with: an estate planning attorney. Do you need a will? Do you need a trust? Do you need to control distribution? Having a good estate planning attorney to work with can help address some of those important questions that you and your family will have. It's also important to have a good CPA and work together with the CPA that goes much further than simply helping, while important, helping you prepare your taxes. That's incredibly important. But beyond that, are your investments tax efficient? Is your approach optimized from a tax standpoint? A good CPA can help you make sure that is indeed the case. Insurance agents, realtors, it is incredibly important to yet again have these professionals available to you so that when the time of need presents itself, you have individuals that you can speak with and be confident in working with. So as we round this out, what is a fiduciary and why is it important? A fiduciary is incredibly important for a couple different reasons. People who call themselves financial professionals, it's not a given that they are a fiduciary. A fiduciary presents themselves in a position where they are legally obligated based on trust for the recommendations that are made and to operate with your best interest in mind. So if you are working with somebody, it's important to ask the question, are you a fiduciary? How do you make decisions? And are you operating with my best interest at heart? We are fiduciaries and we work on behalf of our clients and in the best interest of our clients. So with that, I thank you for the time that you've spent with us. And Ed, I'll turn it back over to you for some question and answer time.
Great, thanks, Dom. Some really good stuff there to finish up. So we have a few questions that have come in, and I'm going to address a couple of them along with you, Dom. So one question came in about the $300,000 figure for healthcare. What does that comprise of? Is this beyond Medicare and supplemental insurance costs, or just all in? And Dom, I'll speak to that briefly, but maybe you can add on. I think this is an all-in number of total healthcare spending including Medicare supplemental gap pop coverages, maybe an assumed average out-of-pocket expenses, right? So it is a broad average of everything. Am I correct in that?
You're absolutely right. Where you go to the next level with that conversation is when you begin to talk about long-term care needs, potential long-term care needs. Through the planning process, you have the ability to understand what some of those local costs might look like. So it's important to look at that. Again, for broad stroke wise, large scale, be able to have a plan and target a number to be able to save for. Beyond that, drill down and have narrow conversations about what some of those local costs are beyond the Medicare discussion, and more so on the long-term care topic.
Yeah, very good. There's a question here about how do you balance the needs and wants and wishes. I think this is really pretty straightforward in that you just really need to sit down, pen to paper, and really grind out a budget. It's not necessarily the most fun thing in the world to do, but I often used to do it years ago with my daughter to talk about her spending and saving, where we would sit down and just for 30 days track expenses and see where, and just gather all the receipts and track it for 1 month. And the good thing is today there's some terrific apps out there that can really break down all of your spending. You can really see what you're spending on, what I'd say is the necessities and really important stuff, the needs, if you will, versus maybe the stuff that is more discretionary and maybe impulsive as well. I think doing that on a regular basis, as Dom say, maybe it's monthly, maybe it's quarterly with your family. I think the genius there is that it keeps it front of mind, and it keeps it in people's as they're going around their daily lives, they're thinking about what they're spending and do they need it, want it, or wish it. Someone had a question of about setting up a family trust for a larger family, and it was set up 20 or 30 years ago. There certainly is a cost to go through setting up an estate plan. Most certainly, we recommend at a minimum, really every 7 to 10 years, you should review and update your estate plan. I mean, laws change, the way things are accepted in the courts change, powers of attorney, proper wording changes regularly, state by state. So, if you're move states, if your estate plan has gone through some significant issues, if your life changes have done as well, and families have changed over time, you really need to update it every 7 to 10 years. And yes, there is a cost to that. Certainly, you can't get around that, but it saves in time and money and angst for your heirs. I look at it as really it's a gift to your heirs to really have a buttoned up estate plan down the road. Let's see. Do you think guidelines here, Madame, I'm going to throw this one to you. Do you think these guidelines to financial discipline vary demographically, or can they be adapted to all walks of life?
It's a great question. It's a great question. And I think there's elements of what we discussed today that can be adapted to each and everybody that's out there. I think it comes down to having the discipline to be intentional about having conversations and the right conversations. I think what we see a lot is the idea of financial values being disparate within the family. And as we grow the family, it introduces additional perspective. And there's just more reason for us to get on the same page. So across the board, these points I think are important. Most importantly, to sit down and just have a discussion versus the mechanics of what's being discussed. Take the initial step.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's all the time we have for Q&A today. But thank you for participating in today's webinar. And remember, there'll be a survey that'll pop up in your web browser after this webinar ends. If you have a specific question that we couldn't get to, that was not answered during the Q&A, make sure to put that in the survey under questions and comments, and we will definitely and gladly follow up with you. If at any time you're looking for more information about Savant and what we do, we invite you to go to savantwealth.com to learn more. Thanks and have a great day.
Thank you, everybody.